You're listening to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series,
a dedicated series that explores all things net zero carbon and sustainability within the built environment.
Alongside some of the biggest names in property, we'll be delving into topics such as
why the market is pushing net zero carbon faster than legislation.
Is renovation and retrofitting better for the planet than new construction?
How can we balance sustainability concerns with profit margins?
And much, much more.
Don't miss any future episodes. Subscribe at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Place Northwest Podcast COP26 series. I'm Julia Hatmaker, Deputy Editor at Place Northwest. Today, we're tackling one of the most exciting sustainable energy movements in the UK, wind. Last year, the UK generated 75,610 gigawatt hours of electricity from offshore and onshore wind. That's enough to power 8.4 trillion LED light bulbs, which I'm not sure why any of us would have 8.4 trillion, but the good news is they can be powered. Wind energy will play a key part in helping the UK meet its net zero goal by 2050. And with COP26 approaching, it's a great time to talk about one of the largest sources of renewable electricity on the planet, which is why I've recruited some wind energy gurus, Chris Calvert and Dale Turner with Pegasus Group. Pegasus Group is a leading development consultancy specializing in planning, design, environment, economics, heritage, transport and infrastructure, and property. The company has considerable experience across the energy sector, including solar, on and offshore wind, bioenergy, tidal power, energy from waste, anaerobic digestion, and hydropower. So, Dale, we are here to talk about wind power. Why should we be pursuing that?
Well, first of all, it's proven, established technology, which is already a critical part of the UK's response to climate change, and we've got targets which are ever increasing in that regard. So last year, it was established by the government that they were going to be looking for a 68% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the end of this decade, 2030, compared to 1990 levels, which is a real marked increase in the challenge that we are looking to move towards as a country, moving forward then to 2050 to achieve net zero compared to 1990 levels, which is a real step change. And wind is one of the main established technologies which has been around for a number of years. It's proven and it's been generating successfully since 1991, and it's something which can be further grown exponentially to help with this challenge, and it's something which has already been in recent years growing, particularly in some parts of the UK, particularly in Scotland, but in certain other areas, for example, in England, since the last sort of 5 years where there's been policy changes, we've seen less growth and development, and there's an opportunity now with this increase in the targets to see that change and to see that grow again.
Yeah, I mean, wind does sound great. And as you mentioned, like we've invested in the past, we've got an opportunity to kind of push forward in the future. Where do we stand now as a country, though, in relation to harnessing all this wind power? Chris, why don't you take that one?
Okay, thank you. In terms of the UK overall, the picture is positive, but you've got to break down into the nation parts. So Scotland has a very proactive renewable energy policy and proactive policy response to onshore wind. There are challenges up there, but the in principle is positive. Very similar position in many ways in respect of Wales. However, England is a very different picture in comparison, and also including Northern Ireland in terms of positivity. But England is a very different position, mainly dictated by a few blunt instruments, and planning being a fairly blunt instrument, and changes to policy that have directed a slowing down of further deployment of onshore wind. So really since that policy shift by coalition and then Conservative government, there's not been an awful lot of new onshore wind in the UK. And kind of where we're at the moment really is making the best of what we've got. So the intention really is to repower, life extend, vary the existing permissions that we have to either retain that energy generation or, in fact, look to enhance that with more modern machines in terms of some of the wind farms that are early 90s, mid 90s onwards, in terms of coming towards the end of their life and their usefulness, but actually being able to use them in a different way as those sites with different machines and alike. So that's where we're at the moment. It's not a great position, I think, for England, because there's an awful lot of potential still to be had. But the policy really that the government has at the minute is really dramatically slowing that. But I think there are some green shoots.
Well, that's good to hear. And I'm glad you mentioned that, planning's a big part of this, because obviously you guys are expert planners. So you already touched on this a little bit. So Chris, I'm going to keep it with you. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what you think we can be doing to fix this problem? And I know that it's going to mean, in particular, extending the life of the wind power plants that we already have. So if you don't mind.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we, at the moment, for the National Planning Policy Framework in England, we have the ability through footnote 54 of that document to repower, which is an umbrella term, and that includes life extension. So typically, planning permissions will have a time expiry, and the default position has for many years been 25 years. The reality is that wind farms can operate well beyond that through the careful management of the machinery, and actually, why just limit that energy production to that particular period of time? So where we're seeing a momentum at the moment is towards the life extension of wind farms, maybe by another 15 to 20 years, and extending the life of that, which makes an awful lot of sense, to be perfectly honest. Why turn off credible, viable, cheap energy at the risk of losing that and the lead-in times for new deployment of completely new sites or technologies? Why give ourselves that vulnerability in energy supply? So, a very subtle change in policy in the footnote 49, as was now 54, as updated, actually has given a momentum of change. That subtle change has made a big difference and a mindset, really. I think we've got some challenges ahead of that in terms of how local authorities deal with that. But by and large, they're very positive, particularly in terms of declaration of local climate change emergencies. So life extension is definitely part of the armament. Next stage is in terms of repowering. What do we do with older wind farms that perhaps really do need to be reimagined, repowered with new machines? But life extension is definitely where it's at the minute. And that's encouraging, because I think I take the view that the perception of building up trust again in terms of onshore wind, lots of the surveys out there at the moment show a favourability towards onshore wind as a technology again. Well, if the industry can overcome perceived issues that they've maybe had in the past from some communities, that onshore wind is a really incredible way to generate the power for all of those LEDs, as you described earlier, Julia. I think that would be great.
Yeah, you can't forget about the 8.4 trillion LED light bulbs. Very important. It's like my stat of the day.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting what you were saying about extending the life, though. Is that something we can only apply when we hit that 25-year mark? Because obviously, I imagine the plants in the 90s are now starting to get on there. Or is it something that you can apply earlier on in the process?
You can apply early on. There's nothing within the guidance that suggests that you can't. So, we're looking at a whole range of wind farms, more recent, within the last decade, within the last 5 years, even going beyond that, to look to life extend and how we might repower them. So there is no limitation on that.
Oh, that's good to know, because I know that I would be inclined to procrastinate and put it off to the last minute, but it's nice to have that insurance of 5 years into it that we're going to have an additional 25 plus. So that's really great, building the stability and the confidence.
Exactly. Yeah. I think there's business case rationale in there for investment and developers as well, with the opportunities for contract for difference as well, with repowering falling into that category, I understand. So the whole ethos around subtle changes in planning policy, contract for difference opportunities is really driving that, and is encouraging, as I've said.
Good stuff. Dale, what do you think we can be doing to increase wind power in the UK?
So in addition to life extension, the next opportunity that the existing sites provide is the potential for repowering. So obviously repowering is is looking at taking down the existing turbines and replacing them with more modern technology. The advantage of that compared to life extension is a modern turbine will have a greater generating capacity than the existing turbines because of the way that the technology is developed over time. And so the potential is that for the same footprint of the site, you can get more renewable energy than what is currently being provided. So you've got an overall increase rather than just continuing to have the same generation as we would get through a life extension option. The potential challenges to repowering compared to life extension, however, are modern turbines are likely to be substantially taller than the ones which are currently on the site. As the technology is developed, the overall height of the turbines and therefore the rotor diameter of the swept area of the wind that they can harvest has grown, which is brilliant from a generation perspective. But in terms of issues such as the visual impact of the turbines for the surrounding landscape and communities, that poses different questions and brings in different issues which may not have been applicable when the smaller turbines were consented in the 90s or a number of years ago. Now, in some cases, a site which was acceptable for smaller turbines will be equally acceptable for larger turbines. But however, there will be some sites where there will be extra sensitivities which bring new challenges to the planning process to go down the repowering option when compared to the life extension option. Chris and I have an example that we worked on in Cumbria, the Kirkby Moor wind farm, where there was an original plan for repowering, which was one which was met with opposition within the community and it was ultimately refused by the local authority. And so in that case, it was then decided to go down the life extension route, and ultimately the life extension was granted consent. And the nature of sites like Kirkby Moor elsewhere in England are ones which might give rise to repowering perhaps being less of a viable option than life extension. But for many other sites, getting that extra generation from the same footprint will be a really invaluable way to go in the future. And indeed, when it comes to Scotland, repowering is already the more favourable way to approach looking at a site when it comes towards the end of its life rather than just a life extension. And there's a more established understanding there of the value that bringing forward larger turbines which can generate more capacity can have, and I think it's likely that Wales will probably have a similar mindset from a policy perspective when it comes to sites there as well. But at the moment, the policy context in England is not quite so favourable when it comes to repowering compared to, say, a life extension approach, and that's perhaps one of the challenges looking forward if the government's going to look to try and really meet these targets and push on in terms of providing more wind. Looking at that policy context around repowering compared to life extension is probably going to be important.
Yeah, and it strikes me so interesting that I feel like in every other aspect of technology, things have gotten smaller, like our cell phones, like the bricks that were there in the 90s to the tiny things we have today. And with wind power, it's the opposite. The turbines have gotten bigger as the technology's gotten better. What an interesting switch on that aspect of things.
Yeah, I think that comes down to commercial viability as well. Yeah, and actually the technologies that's behind it just allows us to harness that wind power far more effectively and efficiently, perhaps through fewer but taller machines. I think just touching on the point that Dale mentioned there earlier in terms of repowering, and it's also relevant in terms of life extension, is just that, and your point about passage of time, it's really important to understand what was the context at the time of consent being granted originally and how has that moved and changed and how does that affect. So Kirkby Moor, for example, the site there next to the Lake District National Park, but also became a World Heritage Site, which obviously ramps up the sensitivity at face value, but obviously is one of those things that our client and ourselves had to grapple with in order to continue to demonstrate the suitability of that site to continue to generate electricity. So there's all sorts of little nuances in there that you just need to pick up, but that's part of an audit really of what you have and what you can do with it. But it's just part of the process.
Yeah, and it strikes me as well that when it comes to, talking about how the newer technology is so much better and can generate so much more energy, is it ever a good idea to just kind of nix an old wind farm and start fresh?
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, there will be the opportunities to remove the existing scheme and perhaps expand the size of the land holding to create a larger wind farm than was there originally. In some cases, it may go the other way, and because of the fact that individual turbines can have greater generation, you may actually be able to have a smaller footprint than was there previously, and still secure greater overall capacity, particularly with the really old schemes where the generation for the individual turbines was very low compared to what we see today. So more radical site design options are certainly also something that can be considered in the mix. Again, in terms of the difference across the UK, you're much more likely to see those more radical approaches in Scotland at the moment, where the policy context is more favourable. In England, it's going to be more of a challenge, perhaps, to do something more radical with these existing sites, not least because I think some of the locations where the original wind farm sites came forward in England are perhaps closer to properties and settlements, and they leave less room for expansion and growth, noting that the size of the turbines is so much greater now. I think some of the areas in Scotland where the first wind farms came forward are a little bit more remote and leave a little bit more room for growth and expansion. But I think the message is very much that it's the right approach for the right site, and it shouldn't be the case that the policy context or the planning context holds back maximising the generating capacity of an existing site or the land in its proximity. And I think at the moment we've seen in the last few years in England in particular, for many sites, the prospect of really getting the maximum generation out of them has been held back a little by the policy context. And I think that's the real area where, with only subtle shifts, you could see quite a dramatic increase to the value that onshore wind energy can give to meeting our climate change targets. And I think particularly when it comes to locations where there are existing turbines, you quite often find a community has an established understanding of what a wind farm is all about. Some of the myths, some of the uncertainties that might have been there when wind was first being established are often put to bed by the community simply being in amongst them and understanding that actually they're perhaps not as noisy, or they're not as visually dominant as you moving in and around a landscape as they might have first imagined. And that makes these existing sites often some of the best locations to look at for developing new schemes, because some of the myths and hostilities that communities who aren't so familiar with wind might have been set aside, and would therefore perhaps give a new scheme a better opportunity of having local support than other areas where people aren't as familiar with the technology.
Indeed, I think that point about subtle changes to policy, particularly in terms of England, and that meaningful change element is really something that needs to start to happen. There's been a gap of some years in terms of local authorities dealing with onshore wind, and as a result, some of the officer level and skill level with local authorities has been lost, simply because they've not had to deal with onshore wind applications. So I think the industry shows leadership. I think the government can show increasing leadership in terms of setting out further guidance and picking up on some of the points that Dale made are actually radical changes, whatever they may be in the context and proportionate to a particular site, shouldn't just be thrown out immediately, and actually to encourage that. The sector is very dynamic in terms of how it approaches sites and schemes, and does always look for appropriate solutions. So we have that on our side to be able to adapt. And I think that's part to the point about then leading into community engagement. One of the tests that's really in the current policy in footnote 54 is to, I'm paraphrasing, and it's not strictly correct, but it's just for the layman, a community test, and or to have a local plan allocation for wind farms. Now that, in terms of local plan allocation, they're incredibly rare for a start. There's only one or two that exist, Rotherham being one, for example. But the overall theme is not particularly positive. So if government can change that, provide guidance that then leads into training to bring local authority officers back up to speed as to how to deal with it and to accept that change is going to happen, and that change isn't a bad thing in the context of a climate change emergency has been declared quite often at local authority level. It's a positive element. And I think, lots of development undertake consultation. But I think wind energy and energy in general has been in the UK has been phenomenal in terms of actually how much engagement our clients put into local communities to actually really get to the heart of a matter, be that good, bad, indifferent. And that's to be celebrated. There's an awful lot of good practice on that. Again, as we build through, and I think we have to do that, is to maximise the resources available in England and the UK as a whole. The sector and the industry is well geared to bring up that community trust and engagement. There are differences of opinion. It's inevitable, but that's no different than anywhere else. But at the moment, because of this community test, wind energy is held back, whereas no other form of development has that same type of wording really within it, within the NPPF. So there's an impediment, and it's that perception. And we need to really get that out of there, to be perfectly honest, and actually allow good sites and good schemes to come forward.
Yeah. So I spent some time before we started today's podcast on the Office of National Statistics site, because that's what I do, because I'm a nerd and I really enjoy stats. And they had some interesting facts about wind. And one of those facts was that offshore and onshore wind sectors generated almost £6 billion in turnover in 2019. And that actually last year was our greenest year on record, which people are attributing to the high levels of wind energy generations. So it strikes me that, the public's kind of missing this other side of the wind schemes, and they're just kind of focused on, the aesthetics and the noise and things like that, and missing out on what makes wind energy so great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at the moment, public awareness of the need to act on climate change is at an all-time high. I think it's moved from something which was of interest to a small number of people, but is now something which is something which the vast majority have an understanding of. We see the effects of climate change now in the UK with some of the extreme weather that we're getting, and politicians have moved away from talking about the consequences of climate change being first and foremost in other countries and in the future to here in the UK and happening already. And I think that means it's an issue which people can't afford to ignore, and they are becoming increasingly aware of what are those things which we as a country are doing to try and address it. And one of the more high profile areas is renewable energy. I think when people see coal-fired power stations being switched off and decommissioned and replaced with wind and solar energy, that's a clear, tangible sign of what we as a country are trying to do, and is something which doesn't cause any particular great day-to-day change for how they're going to live their life for the most part. The electricity still comes when they switch the light on, and it's through a different means, and so they're able to feel like they're contributing to challenging climate change without having to particularly do a great deal of action themselves, other than be mindful of the way that we're changing our generation in the country and be broadly supportive of the narrative. I think the challenge comes particularly with wind when you have a scheme which is promoted in close proximity to where you live, and that's when we can see attitudes shift, because all of a sudden people who can be very reasonable and very pro renewables can all of a sudden be but not in my backyard. And as we see a lot of the time with planning, with regards to all types of development, renewables in particular, can see this shift from people being very reasonable, very proactive about what they think should be happening, until they realise it might have to happen on their doorstep. And I think that's the one challenge still that the industry's perhaps got to address, is not just getting people on board with the idea of wind and the idea of tackling climate change through renewables, but it's accepting that might therefore also have to happen in their community, but that isn't necessarily going to be as impacting as perhaps they might first imagine, which brings me back to my point before about communities where wind is already established, perhaps being a little bit more understanding of this and realising that it's not this big, scary thing, and actually they can happily live amongst a wind energy development without that having to have a massive day-to-day impact on their lives. And so I think it's not just awareness of the benefits of renewables generally, but it's also this understanding that even renewables on your doorstep isn't something that has to be seen as big and scary.
The whole electrification of our economy, EV charging points, they all need something to do that. And it's just counterintuitive to continue to rely on fossil fuels. I've been looking at some stats as well, Julia. So, just
Yes.
looking at the latest. Yeah. Here we go. So, just in terms of stats off. So, in terms of latest stats from the government, there's 134.6 terawatt hours of renewables power generation. That's 12.6% higher than last year. And higher than the 117.8 terawatt hours from fossil fuels. So that shift has happened. Now, last 12, 18 months have seen a little bit of a shift in terms of how we use electricity and everything else. But it is there. The arguments aren't peripheral or seen as overly green. They're seen as incredibly important as to how we live our lives now and into the future. I think it's very, very real. The effects of climate change that we've seen that Dale has talked about make that incredibly real. So, for a long time, I've almost felt people have dismissed that, but I think people can actually see it now. And the way in which you, the press, get things out there and articulate that, understand it, it's very much high level now. And I think the government gets that in principle. They've just got to take the next step as to what we do now. And that could be subtle. I think industry will be clamouring for more blunt force in terms of what to do. Now, whether it's an opening of the floodgates or otherwise, I don't know. But we need to move forward in terms of being positive towards onshore wind, be that new sites, reimagined, repowered sites, so be it. But, we just need to get that step change. And governments are there to lead, and they've got to step up, I think.
To some extent, the example is already there with what the Scottish government are doing, and really, it's more a question of the rest of the UK catching up with that example. That it's not the case that they have to come up with new ideas. The model is already there. There's a strong policy context in Scotland and a clear guidance to enable the sector to grow and develop and contribute to providing that clean green energy that we need. And I think in terms of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, following that example would be a really good starting point. And there aren't dramatic differences in the way the policy set out in Scotland compared to England. It would be relatively subtle, the changes that would need to be made, but those subtle differences would be all it would take to give the sector in England again a massive boost and to start to see it move forward in the way that we've continued to see develop in Scotland over the last 5 years.
What are those subtle differences, though?
So I think footnote 54, an amendment to that and/or removal. The perception that's putting some kind of a brake on the industry is a good thing by government in current guidance is misheld. Up in Scotland, that proactive response is backed up by guidance that decision makers can look to, scheme designers like ourselves can look to with clients. So it doesn't automatically equate to any perception of taking off the brakes to try and stop the deployment, resulting in bad schemes. If anything, with good guidance, good training, clear purpose, you actually get good schemes that come out of this. Now, inevitably, there will be schemes that don't get consent, but if the guidance is there, then those good schemes will come to the top and they'll get going. So those are the sort of subtle things that can really happen. I think it's government just making that step change to realise that's the case, but it needs an awful lot of effort on their part, and that's the challenge for them because there's not an awful lot of time at the moment on on all sorts of fronts. But given that we are hosting the world's largest event on combating climate change, wouldn't it be great to see planning changes starting to be announced and coming through? They are doing on national level for those schemes of national significance, but actually, let's see that filter through to Joe Blogs and every developer in between that actually can see a bit of line of intent, give them some market certainty, give them some planning certainty, manage the risks, look at the relationship with communities, overlooking noise, landscape effect, shadow flicker, undoubtedly, but actually come forward with schemes.
So I feel like I kind of have a sense of how you guys are going to answer this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Where do you all feel that we are as a country when it comes to the future of onshore wind? Are we on the right path? Are we totally in the wrong direction? Do we just need to do some minor course correction? What's going on?
I think as an industry, wind has made great strides over the last 25 years. It provides a really important element of our approach to tackling climate change in this country, but we could do more. And in particular, certain parts of the UK could be doing more than they currently are. I think in Scotland, largely speaking, they're leading the way and they really are pushing the envelope when compared to what's happening in England. And I think in England in particular, there could be an improvement. Up until a few years ago, the sector in England was buoyant and schemes were coming forward and adding their contribution. Over the last 5 years with the planning changes that have been in place, that has slowed down and Scotland has very much overtaken England in terms of its contribution. I think if England's policy context was to change and developers were to come back into England in the way that they are in Scotland, we would see the trajectory start to move back to where it needs to be, because there's no doubt that if we are going to meet the ambitious targets that the country's set for combating climate change, renewable energy, onshore wind in particular, across the whole of the UK needs to continue to grow and develop and take advantage of the good start that it's had since the infancy of the sector in the 90s.
Chris?
Yeah, it's just echoing that. There's not much more to say after Dale has said that. I think he's pitched it perfectly. But it's leadership, really, now. That's Prime Minister downwards. I think it's cross-party as well in terms of an overall push and initiative, because not every local authority in England is Conservative. They are Labour, they are Lib Dem, they're everywhere in between on the political spectrum. It's ownership of combating climate change. There's plenty of local authorities declaring climate change, but actually, are they themselves prepared to make a step change in their own planning policy, their direction of travel of how they will receive a new wind farm application, be that a life extension or repowering, and actually go, you know what, we've made all these bold claims that we're going to do everything that we can. And I've just been reading one this morning where they're actually saying they want to be even further ahead of, at a local authority level, of the government's targets by 2050. Well, actually, what does that mean in practice? And at a local level in particular, planning decisions have an effect upon voting patterns for whatever that might be, and wind energy is certainly no different. But are they prepared to stand up, be counted, and accept good quality, well-conceived, well-designed schemes that actually will make a difference, and stand back and say, yeah, we said we were going to do this, and we have done it, irrespective of what's happening at national level. So I think it's really that ownership at the national and local leadership levels, and that step change.
So to recap, wind energy is proven, it's sustainable energy that works, and we need to be doing more of it, especially in England, which needs to step up its wind energy game and start looking towards Scotland and emulating some of those policies. People need to say, yes, put it in my backyard if they're part of a community, because the communities and at a local level, we need to be showing support as well for these schemes. And we need to start working with what we already have, whether that means extending the life of some of the wind farms that we've got already, upgrading them so we can repower them and get some more energy out of there, or, if necessary, wiping the slate clean and starting fresh and putting in some new technology there. Is that about right? Did I kind of summarize all the points, or is there something I missed?
Yeah, spot on.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me. Dale, Chris, y'all were great. Hope you had a good time.
Yeah, that's been brilliant. Thank you.
It was very good. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
If you want to find out more about wind energy and the planning process, check out pegasusgroup.co.uk, or you can always email inquiries@pegasusgroup.co.uk. Thank you so much for joining today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And as a reminder, this is just one part of our COP26 podcast series, which we're releasing in the lead up to the COP26 Climate Change Conference. So don't miss an episode. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Julia Hatmaker, and I hope you have an excellent day.